She learned very early that the world had a way of deciding who mattered and who did not. Long before anyone ever spoke their dreams out loud. It happened in the small moments, the way people looked past her, the way teachers paused before calling her name, the way adults smiled politely and then moved on as if she were already finished before she had even begun. She did not know the word doubt back then, but she felt it sitting quietly in her chest, like something unfinished, something waiting. She grew up in a place where houses leaned a little too close to each other, and windows carried more stories than light. Mornings began with the sound of buses sighing at the corner, and evenings ended with tired footsteps climbing wooden stairs. Her mother worked long hours. Anne came home with hands that smelled like soap and effort. Her father was a shadow in old photographs, a presence that faded before she learned how to ask why. At school, she sat near the window not because she liked the view, but because it gave her space to breathe. The other children spoke louder, laughed faster, dreamed bigger, or at least they sounded like they did. She learned to keep her thoughts folded neatly inside her like letters she never mailed. There was a moment she remembered clearly, though she had been no more than 9, when the teacher asked what everyone wanted to be when they grew up. Hands flew into the air: doctor, lawyer, athlete, artist. When it was her turn, she hesitated, not because she had no dream, but because she had too many and none of them felt safe enough to say out loud. She finally whispered something small, something acceptable, something that would not make anyone look twice. The teacher nodded and moved on, and in that nod, she felt it, the quiet agreement that her life would be ordinary, that nothing remarkable was expected from her. But even then, something inside her refused to disappear completely. It did not shout or demand attention. It simply stayed, a steady pulse, reminding her that she was more than what people saw, more than the assumptions made in passing, more than the silence she wore like armor. As the years passed, doubt followed her like a second shadow. When she tried harder, people said she was trying too much. When she stayed quiet, they said she lacked confidence. Every version of herself seemed wrong to someone, and slowly, she began to wonder if maybe they were right. In high school, she worked after classes, stacking shelves, cleaning tables, saving money. She did not yet know how she would use. Teachers told her to be realistic. Counselors suggested safer paths, easier paths, paths that did not require belief. They spoke kindly, but kindness can still carry limits, and she felt those limits closing in around her dreams. At night, she lay awake listening to the house settle, wondering how some people seemed so sure of themselves while she felt like she was constantly asking permission just to exist. She imagined a future that looked different, but every time she tried to picture it, doubt crept in. Wearing familiar faces, whispering familiar words: be practical, be careful, do not aim too high. There were moments she almost listened, moments when exhaustion made surrender feel like rest, moments when proving everyone right seemed easier than proving them wrong. But then something small would happen: a comment overheard, a door closed too quickly, an opportunity given to someone else without question, and the fire would return, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unignorable. By the time she reached adulthood, she had learned how to smile in a way that reassured others that she was fine even when she was not. She learned how to make herself smaller so others could remain comfortable. She learned how to carry disappointment gracefully as if it were part of her personality. What no one saw was how deeply she felt everything, how every doubt spoken aloud became fuel, how every dismissal carved determination into her bones, how every quiet night strengthened her resolve in ways she did not yet understand. They doubted her in subtle ways and obvious ones, in conversations that ended too soon, in opportunities that never came her way, in expectations that were always just a little lower than everyone else's. But she listened, she watched, she learned. And without realizing it, she was preparing herself not for the life they imagined for her, but for the life she would one day claim. Because the truth was, she had never been weak, she had simply been waiting. Waiting for the moment when doubt would no longer define her. Waiting for the moment when her quiet strength would finally have space to rise. And that moment was closer than anyone knew. She stepped into adulthood the way she had stepped into everything else, carefully, quietly, carrying more questions than answers. The world seemed louder, now faster, more demanding, and somehow still uninterested in what she had to say. She took the first job she was offered. Not because it inspired her, but because survival rarely waits for passion. The office was small, the walls beige, the smiles polite and temporary. She learned quickly how to blend and how to arrive early, leave late, and never complain. People around her talked about ambition as if it were something you could wear openly like a badge. She listened, nodded, and kept her own thoughts hidden. She worked harder than most, not because she wanted recognition, but because effort felt like the only language she spoke. Fluently, still promotions went to others, opportunities passed her desk without stopping. Feedback came wrapped in soft words, but sharp meaning, dependable, reliable, steady, not leadership material, not bold enough. She heard the doubt even when it was not spoken. It lived in the pauses before responses, in the way meetings moved on without her input, in the advice she never asked for. About knowing her limits, at first she wondered if maybe she really was asking for too much. Maybe this was all she was meant to be, a background presence, someone who supported other people's visions. But nights were harder than days at home. The quiet pressed in, and her thoughts grew louder. She replayed conversations, analyzed expressions, questioned every choice she made. There were evenings she sat on the floor, staring at nothing, wondering how she could feel so invisible in a world full of people. She felt tired in a way sleep could not fix, tired of proving herself, tired of hoping, tired of waiting. Family gatherings brought their own kind of weight, questions about stability, about settling down, about being grateful for what she had, well-meaning words that carried expectations. She smiled, answered politely, and swallowed the ache that followed her back home. She wanted more, not more money, not more status, but more meaning, more space to be herself without apology. She tried once to speak up in a meeting, her voice steady, her idea carefully thought out. The room went quiet, then someone else repeated the same thought minutes later and received nods, approval, praise. She sat there stunned, heat rising to her face, doubt roaring louder than ever, telling her this was proof, this was confirmation she was not meant to lead. That night, she cried, not dramatically, not loudly, but deeply, tears soaking into a pillow as she tried to release years of silence. She considered quitting, changing paths, disappearing into something easier, something smaller. She opened her laptop, searched for alternatives, safer choices, realistic goals. Every option felt like a compromise with herself. The following weeks were heavy, each day blending into the next. Her energy faded, her smile became practiced. She moved through life on autopilot, checking boxes, meeting expectations, slowly disconnecting from the part of her that once dreamed freely. She felt herself shrinking, and it scared her more than failure ever had. Then came the conversation that broke something open. Her supervisor called her and spoke gently about restructuring, about performance, about fit. The words blurred together, but the message landed clearly. She was replaceable, her work appreciated, but not enough to invest in long-term growth. She nodded, thanked them, and walked out, holding herself together until she reached her car. Sitting there alone, hands gripping the steering wheel, she felt the full weight of it all, the years of effort, the constant doubt, the quiet endurance she had mistaken for patience. Something inside her cracked, not into despair, but into clarity. She realized that waiting for permission had cost her pieces of herself she could never get back. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel angry, not at them, but at the version of herself who believed their limits were her own. The anger was unfamiliar, but it brought with it a strange relief, as if she had finally acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding. That night, she did not cry. She sat at her table, notebook open, and wrote everything she had never said, everything she wanted, everything she feared. The pages filled quickly, her handwriting messy, urgent, honest. She saw patterns emerge, skills she had downplayed, strengths she had ignored, resilience she had never named. She remembered the child who sat by the window dreaming quietly, and understood that child had never left. She had simply been silenced. She promised herself something then, not a grand vow, not a dramatic declaration, but a simple commitment to stop disappearing. Change did not come overnight. It began in small acts, applying for roles that scared her, speaking once more even when her voice trembled, enrolling in a course she had always thought was beyond her, reaching out to mentors who challenged her instead of comforting her. Every step felt heavy but real. People noticed the shift, some reacted with surprise, others with skepticism. A few tried to pull her back into familiar roles, reminding her who she had been. She listened respectfully, but no longer absorbed their doubt. She had learned how easily it could take root. There were setbacks, rejections, moments when old fears resurfaced, telling her she was foolish for trying, but now she recognized those voices for what they were, echoes, not truth. She kept moving forward, not because she was confident, but because stopping felt worse. Slowly, quietly, she began to build something new, not just a career, but a sense of self grounded in effort and intention. She stopped asking if she was allowed to want more and started asking what it would take to get there. The world had not changed, but she had, and that made all the difference. And though no one was applauding, yet no one was watching closely enough to see the shift, she felt it deep within her, a turning point, a beginning. They still doubted her. She could sense it in the way opportunities were offered cautiously, in the raised eyebrows when she spoke of her plans, but for the first time their doubt no longer defined her path. She was no longer waiting. She was moving. The first real test came sooner than she expected, not wrapped in encouragement or gentle opportunity, but in pressure, the kind that exposes every fear she had ever tried to hide. She accepted a role that placed her visibly in front of others, a chance to lead a project many believed she was not ready for. Whispers followed her into rooms, questions lingered in glances, people spoke to her carefully as if expecting her to stumble. At the beginning she tried to over-prepare, believing effort alone could silence doubt. She worked late, memorized details, anticipated every possible outcome. But confidence is not built overnight, and when the moment came to present her vision, her hands shook just enough for her to notice. The room felt too bright, too quiet. She spoke clearly, but the words felt heavier than usual, like they were carrying more than information, they were carrying her worth. The questions came sharp and relentless, some fair, some pointed, some clearly designed to test her limits. She answered as best she could, but felt herself falter under the weight of expectation. When it ended, the feedback was immediate and public, suggestions phrased like correction, smiles that did not quite reach the eyes. She thanked them, gathered her notes, and walked away feeling exposed. That evening the doubt returned, louder than it had been in years, replaying every moment, magnifying every mistake, convincing her she had confirmed what everyone suspected. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the old urge to retreat, to become smaller again, to apologize for trying. The following weeks were unforgiving. Progress slowed, obstacles multiplied, mistakes were noticed more than successes. A minor error escalated into a visible failure, timelines slipped, trust wavered, the room grew tense, and when the project finally collapsed under pressure, the blame settled quietly but firmly on her shoulders. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a meeting, a conversation, measured and disappointing. Disappointment carries a particular weight, heavier than anger, more personal, more final. She listened, nodded, accepted responsibility, and walked out, once again feeling the familiar sting of being underestimated. This time, though, something was different. The pain was real, but it did not hollow her out, it grounded her. She felt the failure fully, without flinching, without excuses. She allowed herself to grieve what she had hoped for, and then she asked herself a question she had never asked before: what did I learn? She took time away, not to hide, but to reflect. She reviewed everything honestly, without cruelty. She saw where fear had held her back, where silence had cost her, where she had still been seeking approval instead of owning her voice. The realization was uncomfortable but freeing. When she returned, she did not announce herself. She simply showed up differently. She spoke with intention. Even when her voice trembled, she asked questions without apologizing. She acknowledged mistakes without shrinking. She stopped trying to prove she belonged and focused instead on contributing fully. Some people noticed, others did not change their minds. Doubt does not disappear easily, but gradually her work began to speak in ways she no longer needed to explain. Results followed, consistency built trust, small wins accumulated quietly. There was a moment months later when a decision needed to be made quickly. The room turned toward her. Instinctively she answered without hesitation, and no one questioned it. The moment passed without ceremony, but she felt it deeply. It was proof, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. She realized then that strength had never been about never failing. It was about staying present after failure, about choosing growth over retreat, about believing in yourself even when no one else does. They had doubted her, and some still did, but now she understood doubt was not a verdict, it was a challenge. And she was no longer afraid of it. Momentum does not announce itself, it builds quietly through repetition, through choices made. When no one is watching, she continued, showing up steady, focused, no longer trying to be impressive, only honest with her work. The respect she had once chased now followed at a distance, cautious but present. People began to seek her input, not out of obligation, but trust. Her ideas were no longer overlooked, they were tested, implemented, refined. She noticed the shift in subtle ways: fewer interruptions, more eye contact, longer conversations that extended beyond meetings. Inside her, confidence settled into something calm, no longer reactive, no longer dependent on praise. She trusted her preparation, her instincts, her ability to learn. When she did not know the answer, the doubt that once paralyzed her now served as a signal to grow. Then came the opportunity that mattered, not because it was glamorous, But because it was a complex problem, no one wanted to take ownership of a situation layered with risk, limited resources, and high expectations, the kind of challenge that reveals who is willing to stand forward and who prefers safety. She volunteered without hesitation. The room paused, some surprised, some concerned, some silently skeptical, but no one stopped her. She gathered a small team, set clear intentions, and began not loudly, not aggressively, but with purpose. There were setbacks, moments when old fears tried to resurface, but she met them with experience. Instead of panic, she listened, adapted, adjusted. She held space for others, while holding her own ground. Leadership no longer felt like performance, it felt like service. Weeks passed, then months. Progress became visible. Metrics improved, tension eased, solutions emerged. Her team found rhythm and trust, and when challenges arose, they turned to her instinctively, not because she demanded authority, but because she earned it. The success was undeniable, not perfect, but effective, and when the project concluded, the acknowledgement came publicly. This time, recognition delivered without qualifiers, without hesitation. Applause filled the room, brief, sincere, meaningful. She stood there, absorbing it quietly, feeling the weight of the journey behind her. Afterward, people approached, offering praise, stories of how they had underestimated her, confessions wrapped in smiles. She accepted them gracefully, understanding that validation from others was no longer the fuel it once was. She went home that night and sat in silence, reflecting on how far she had come from the woman who once questioned her place. She thought of every moment she had almost given up, every doubt she had carried, and felt gratitude for the resilience that had carried her forward. This was not the end, it was confirmation, proof that she was capable, not because she had finally convinced others, but because she had stopped doubting herself. They had doubted her, and she had proven something, not just to them but to herself. Success has a way of reaching beyond the places it was earned, touching corners of life that once felt disconnected. Her work began to shape how she moved through the world, how she spoke, how she listened, how she saw herself. In quiet reflections, she noticed the change in her posture, the ease in her breath, the way she no longer rushed to fill silence. At family gatherings, the questions shifted from concern to curiosity, from advice to respect. She answered without defensiveness, sharing her journey honestly, not as proof, but as truth. She felt closer to them now that she was no longer hiding pieces of herself. Friends reached out, some inspired, some seeking guidance. She listened, remembering how isolating the climb had been. She offered encouragement, not polished answers, reminding them that doubt does not disqualify anyone, it only reveals where courage is needed. She found fulfillment not in accolades, but in alignment, in knowing her efforts reflected her values, in mentoring others, especially women who reminded her of her younger self, hesitant, capable, waiting. She saw how her presence alone shifted rooms, how representation mattered, how quiet strength creates space for others to step forward. There were moments of reflection, late nights, when she revisited the past, not with regret, but understanding. She forgave herself for the years spent waiting, recognizing that growth requires timing. She had learned patience, resilience, and empathy in ways success alone could not teach. She also acknowledged the pain, the dismissals, the failures, the loneliness, honoring them as part of the foundation that held her now. Every scar carried a lesson, every doubt a doorway. The most profound change was internal, a sense of peace that came from self-trust. She no longer needed to prove anything. Her worth was not measured by titles or approval, but by integrity and effort. She realized then that proving them wrong had never been the goal, it had been a byproduct. The real victory was reclaiming her voice, her confidence, her right to dream openly. They may have doubted her, but she had believed in herself when it mattered most. As time moved forward, the effects of her journey reached farther than she ever intended. Her work became a reference point, her name associated with reliability, insight, quiet leadership. She was invited into spaces that once felt closed, rooms where decisions were shaped, conversations that mattered. She entered them without intimidation, carrying experience instead of expectation. Recognition arrived in different forms: articles, mentions, awards, none of which felt as heavy as the responsibility she felt to remain grounded. She accepted opportunities, thoughtfully aware that visibility brings both influence and scrutiny. She chose to lead in ways that reflected the lessons learned in doubt and perseverance. She developed a philosophy shaped by struggle, that success is not a straight line, that confidence is built through action, not affirmation, that courage often whispers before it roars. She shared these truths openly, hoping to demystify the path for those watching from the edges. People listened not because her story was flawless, but because it was honest. She spoke of fear and failure as companions, not enemies. She reminded audiences that being doubted does not diminish potential, it clarifies purpose. In quieter moments, she returned to the beginning, remembering the child by the window, the woman in the car gripping the steering wheel, the leader standing firm under scrutiny. She carried them all within her, honoring each version for bringing her here. She understood now that legacy is not built through titles, but through impact in the lives touched, in the confidence sparked in others, in the permission given to try despite uncertainty. As she prepared for what lay ahead, she did not chase ambition, she followed intention. The road was still challenging, but it no longer felt lonely. She had learned how to walk it fully, present fully herself. They doubted her, and in doing so they unknowingly shaped a strength that could not be taken away. The moment that brought everything full circle arrived quietly. Without warning, she was invited to speak at an event in the same city where she had once felt invisible, the building familiar, the streets unchanged, yet everything inside her different. As she stood backstage, listening to the low hum of the crowd, she felt the weight of memory settle gently, not as fear, but as recognition. She walked onto the stage and paused, not for effect, but for grounding. She looked out and saw faces filled with expectation, curiosity, and perhaps a little doubt, and she smiled because she understood them. She understood what it meant to sit in uncertainty, wondering if effort would ever be enough. She did not begin with achievement or credentials. She began with honesty. She spoke of silence, of being overlooked, of sitting by windows and learning to dream quietly. She spoke of failure, of public mistakes, of nights spent questioning her worth. The room grew still, not because she demanded attention, but because truth has its own gravity. As she continued, she felt the presence of every version of herself standing alongside her, the child, the young woman, the leader, each one necessary, each one brave in her own way. She told the audience that strength is not loud, that courage often feels like staying when leaving would be easier. She looked toward the back of the room and imagined someone sitting there doubting themselves, feeling unseen, and she addressed them directly, reminding them that being underestimated is not a sentence, it is an invitation to grow beyond the limits placed by others. Her words did not rise, they settled, they landed gently but deeply, and when she finished there was no immediate applause, just a breath shared across the room, and then the sound came, full, warm, sustained. She stepped back, overwhelmed not by pride, but by connection. Later, as she walked alone through familiar streets, she felt the circle close. The place that once held her doubt now held her truth. She realized then that proving them wrong had never been about changing their minds, it had been about changing her own. They had doubted her, and she had answered with persistence, grace, and unwavering belief. She returned home that night and sat by the window the same way she once had years ago, but the view no longer felt like an escape, it felt like a mirror reflecting how far she had traveled. The streetlights glowed softly, and the quiet no longer pressed against her, it welcomed her. She thought about all the moments that had shaped her, the doubts spoken and unspoken, the doors that closed, the ones she pushed open with trembling hands. She felt gratitude, not just for the victories, but for the waiting, for the lessons learned in silence, for the strength built when no one was watching. In the days that followed, messages arrived from strangers who had heard her speak. Stories poured in of people standing at the edges of their own courage, unsure but willing. She read each one, slowly feeling the weight of responsibility and the beauty of shared humanity. She understood now that stories do not end when success arrives, they begin again in the lives they touch. She continued her work with the same quiet commitment she had always carried, but now it was lighter, infused with purpose. She mentored without hierarchy, she listened without judgment, she led without needing to be seen. She understood that the greatest impact often happens away from applause. There were still challenges, moments of fatigue, moments when doubt tried to return wearing new faces, but she met them with compassion and clarity. She reminded herself that strength is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward with it. Sometimes she visited schools, community centers, small gatherings where the rooms were modest and the audiences uncertain. She spoke gently, sharing not just triumphs, but truths. She told them that it is okay to be unsure, that it is okay to take time, that it is okay to want more even when you are told to be grateful for less. She watched eyes change, posture straighten, breath deepen, and she knew the message was landing not because it promised ease, but because it honored effort. At home she kept the notebook she once filled on the night. Everything shifted. She added to it from time to time reflections, lessons, reminders written not for others, but for herself. She wrote that waiting is not weakness when it is paired with intention. She wrote that voices grow stronger when they are used. She wrote that belief is built one brave step at a time. On quiet mornings, she brewed coffee and stood in the light, letting it fall across her face. She felt peace in those moments, a peace earned, not given, a peace rooted in self-trust. She no longer measured her life by how far she had come compared to others, but by how aligned she felt with her own values. She understood that success is not a destination, it is a practice, a way of showing up fully, honestly, repeatedly. If someone asked her now what had changed, she would say very little, and everything she would say: the world still doubts women who are quiet, still underestimates those who do not demand attention, still places limits where curiosity should live, but she would also say that none of that has the power it once did. Because she knows now that doubt can shape you or sharpen you, and she chose the latter. She chose to keep going when it was uncomfortable to speak, when it would have been easier to stay silent, to believe when evidence was thin, to lead with grace in rooms that were not built for her. They doubted her. And in that doubt, she found her strength. She found her voice. She found her people. And she learned that you are never truly alone when you stand in your truth. This is not just her story. It belongs to anyone who has been overlooked, underestimated, told to be realistic, told to wait, told to be less. It is for the ones who carry dreams quietly, who work steadily, who rise slowly but surely. It is a reminder that courage does not need permission. That strength does not need approval. That belief, when practiced daily, becomes unbreakable. She turned from the window and moved forward into the life she had built, step by step, breath by breath, choice by choice. And somewhere, someone listening felt seen, felt encouraged, felt less alone. And that was enough.